بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. صباح الخير. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll be starting the session. We have Sheikh Mustafa Umar with us, and we are doing a 25-minute session today on the rulings of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and video games. And then we'll have a 20-minute question and answer session afterwards, inshallah. We also have later, if you see in the schedule, at 11:30 a.m., there's a dedicated Q&A panel for the first morning session, so that will also be available. Sheikh Mustafa will be here to discuss further questions. And if you want to refer to your book, it's the first paper in the book, page 13 is where the presentation starts from. Barakallahu feekum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. Alhamdulillah, we have covered a few topics here, and I'm going to first be presenting Dr. Salah Sawi's paper, and then I'll be presenting my paper and Sheikh Umer Khan's paper. So let me get right into it, inshallah. So Sheikh Salah, he begins with an overview of the topic, and if you are reading his paper, it's a 50-page paper that he has written on many topics, and I'm going to be covering section 1, which is pages 5 through 10 in his published paper. So he begins by talking about general principles of using technology. So he talks about so some of you may not have read the actual question. So there was a very detailed question about what are the general principles when it comes to using websites, when it comes to using social media, when it comes to using different apps and different programs. So there's a bunch of sub-questions that were there. So the researchers were given these questions by AMJA, and we were told to answer these specific questions, and they were grouped by topic. So if you're wondering, you say, well, why didn't you cover this other topic? Or why didn't you cover this subtopic? These were the topics that were actually given to the researchers by AMJA, so we're answering those in case you've not seen the question. But if you look at our paper, we have pasted the question there, explaining what these questions that were given to us were. So Dr. Salah, he begins by explaining the general principles of technology, because that was the first section that was given to us to answer. So how do we deal with things which are forbidden in all of these different platforms and technologies that we use? So he begins with the principle of umum al-balwa. And umum al-balwa, according to the ulama here, I don't even need to define this, but AMJA has recently opened to tulab al-ilm. So some of them are still studying, some of them may not understand these terms. So I will be defining some of these Arabic terms. So you have to please, excuse me if you're like, we're fuqaha here, we already know these terms. I know for the fuqaha, you don't need these explanations. So I'm not trying to, belittle you or anything like that. But this is for some of the visitors and for the guests who are here. So umum al-balwa basically means like general need. There's a general need for certain things in society. And when it comes to fiqh, when it comes to the sharia, it takes into consideration that when people actually need something in society and it's going to be very beneficial for them, then that's one of the principles that's used. So he mentions the first principle that we're going to take into consideration. Then he mentions another principle of weighing the mafasid and the masalih. So there's harms in the technology that's being used, but then there's also masalih, there's also a lot of benefits, and these two things get mixed. And what do we do when these two things get mixed together? So he says the general rule is when it comes to using technology like this, this falls in the category of masail siyasiyah. And siyasiyah does not mean politics. Siyasiyah in this context means things where there is room for utilizing these principles and weighing and choosing what is going to be greater, the greater benefit or the greater harm. And then the Sheikh continues and he says, okay, a lot of these programs, a lot of these shows, a lot of things that we see, YouTube, whatever, it contains music. So let's look at the music issue. So he said that AMJA has declared in a previous fatwa that musical instruments are unlawful. And the exception would be like a duff at a party or walima or something like that. So he says because of that, we have to use the same fatwa that we had given at AMJA, this is Sheikh Salah speaking, that has been given at AMJA. And because of that, we need to look into what do we do when there's music in a program. And then he says that there's an exception to the rule when it comes to something like shows that are made by other people, like if you want to watch the news or if you need to watch a cartoon or something like that, we go back to the principle of umum al-balwa, that there's a general need for these things. You need to know what's going on in the news. You have a news broadcast and there's going to be background music in there. So what do? You go back to the idea that there's a lot of masalih, there's a lot of benefit that's going to come from that. So therefore, if the music is not being played in that video for itself, but it's like a background sound to get the information. So it's like if your kids are watching a cartoon and there's background music, they're watching it for the cartoon, not for the music. If you're getting the news, you're watching it for the information, you're not watching it for the background music. So he's saying that in that case, it's going to be an exception to the rule because there is a significant amount of benefit. We're going to leave aside the fact that there is background music in there. And then he mentions another general principle. He says there are some books that have truth and they have falsehood mixed in them. So he says we can take a principle that the fuqaha have given fatwas on in the past, and he says they say if the good prevails in that book, you just avoid the bad things that are there, but you also have to differentiate between someone who's a beginning reader, an intermediate reader, and someone who's like an expert, an advanced person who can understand the falsehood and the bad things that are inside of that book. So he says you use the same principle when it comes to social media. Use the same principle when it comes to YouTube. Use the same principle when it comes to all the other forms of technology, is that on the one hand, you are making sure that whatever you're doing it because there's some benefit and the benefit outweighs the harm, but also you have to give a different fatwa according to the person. So maybe one person, if they're at a beginner, they can't understand what's going on. The first time they're using TikTok in their life, this was discussed last night, there's a lot of potential harm in there. So a beginner person may not be able to handle this, so they should stay away from TikTok, for example. This was part of last night's discussion. But someone who's an expert and knows how to do content filtering and knows how to make sure not to get into all of these things and knows how the algorithms work, they're going to be given a different fatwa for using that particular technology. And Sheikh Salah simply says, take that example and apply it to all the other rulings when it comes to general principles. And then he says the general rule on all of these is that you should try to avoid it when you can, and you should be cautious unless there's going to be some significant benefit. And what are significant benefits? Either increasing in knowledge, like some type of knowledge that you need, or some type of da'wah tool that you're going to be using it for, or something along those lines. So he's saying while you're using that, try to lower the volume when the music is being played. If you see some immodest clothing or something like that, try to avert your sight from that and not look at it. So you are minimizing the amount of harm that's already there. Even though the harm was small, you still minimize it even more to the extent possible. And the last thing he says on this, which is really, I find very beautiful, is that he says scholars are going to differ in their ijtihad of when something is beneficial enough to ignore or allow the harms that are there. And he says what we should be doing is we have to understand that there's going to be ijtihad where some scholar says that TikTok is haram. And there's going to be ijtihad where another scholar says no, TikTok is not at the level of being haram, it's maybe makruh, or maybe someone says it's jaiz. So we should respect the differences of opinion that scholars have with regards to the ijtihad. Ijtihad means like their preferences in choosing an opinion in fiqh. We should respect those differences because not everything is clear-cut in this field. So he mentions these general principles, and then he moves to the second topic and he talks about video games. Now he says there are games with haram things, and those haram things were listed in the question. So it says, what if there's nudity, and what if there's profanity, and what if there's drinking alcohol, and what if there is desecrating the image of Islam, and what if there is harming Muslims or pretending to harm Muslims or something like that. So Sheikh Salah says that he came across a game where you get 100 points if you destroy or you bomb Mecca or Medina or Baghdad or one of these things. And he says, how can a Muslim play a game like that? And then he talks about some games where they glorify the cross, this promotion of Christianity. And then there are games where there's immodest women and they're not dressed properly. And then there are games that have music. And he talked about music already before. So he's saying that the general principle is if this is distracting you from your obligations in life, dunya obligations or akhirah obligations, then it's not going to be allowed to do these types of video games. But then he says, okay, let's look at the idea of looking at a drawing. This is another mas'ala, this is another issue. Looking at a drawing, like let's say the video game is a 3D rendering or it's a cartoon type, animation game or something. So he's saying that when you look at a drawing, scholars have made an argument that if you look at a drawing where a woman is not dressed properly, they said that there's a difference. Some scholars have said there's a difference between a real woman's immodest, showing her awra and all of that, or a man's awra, and something that's a depiction of that. So he says that the general principle when it comes to this is if it arouses feelings or causes something, then it's going to be prohibited. So he quotes 3 fatwas. The first one is a fatwa of Ibn Hajar al-Haythami. Another one is the Shafi'i scholar. Another one is of modern contemporary scholar Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen. And the third one he quotes is a Hanafi scholar, a well-known classical fiqh book called Al-Jawharatul Nayyira. And he basically talks about Hurmatul Musahara, which is in the Hanafi school. And I'm not going to explain that because it would take too much time. But he says that if you look at the private parts of a person, this is an old text, in a mirror, does it have the same ruling for Hurmatul Musahara or it doesn't? And he gives the opinion that it's not in the same category. He said, what if you see the private parts of a person in the reflection of like a lake or a pond? Is it going to be in the same category or not? And they say, no, it's not in the same category because you're not actually looking at the actual private parts of the person. So he says, scholars have made this differentiation between a real life person looking at them or a depiction of a person, even if it ended up being a reflection in a mirror or a reflection in water. So Shaykh Salah quotes this and he comes back and says, but the opinion of looking at private parts of even a picture or a depiction or a cartoon of nakedness, this is the marjuh opinion. So he does not accept this opinion, but he quotes it and saying that some scholars have mentioned that this is something that, they were okay with. Moving on, video games. He's saying playing games is generally against the purpose of life. So he quotes the verse, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ I have not created people and jinn except to worship me. He quotes a hadith that everyone يُسْأَلُ عَنْ عُمْرِهِ everyone will be asked about how they spent their life and how they spent their time in this world. So they should think about how much games they want to be wasting with their life. But then, after mentioning that general principle, he quotes Imam al-Shatibi in Kitab al-Muwafaqat. And he says, Imam al-Shatibi, he says, he takes the mubah, what's permissible, and he defines it into 5 different categories. And he says, these categories are going to apply to video games in general. So if the fatwa is that video games in general are mubah, then we have to go and look at these details. So he quotes Imam al-Shatibi, and Shatibi says that mubah and haram is either going to be bil juz or bil kul. It's either going to be in part or it's going to be in whole. And he mentions these 4 categories. And it's a very long quote of Shatibi that he puts in his paper, and he puts it in twice. And I'm going to show you the second place where he puts it. So he says type 1. Type 1 mubah is if you enjoy something nice like nice food, nice drink, nice vehicle, nice clothing or something like that. He says this is mubahun bil juz. This is allowed in parts. Meaning that if it's left completely by all people, then it'll fall into the category of makruh, right? If you leave it out all the time, because then your clothes will be dirty, your appearance will be bad, society will be harmed, all of that. Number 2, he says eating, drinking, intercourse, and trade. Second type of mubah. He says if this is also mubah bil juz, but if you leave it completely, it would actually be haram. Because if everyone abandoned these things, you're going to have massive problems in society. Then Shatibi says, walking around in a garden, listening to birds singing and all of that, this is also in the category of mubah. But if you do it all the time, you're wasting your life away, it becomes makruh. This is category number 4, something that's mubah, but it'll harm your adala, meaning it'll harm your reputation if you do it excessively. Like playing chess or playing backgammon, even when there's no gambling involved. So it's mubah technically, bil asl, like originally, but if you do it so much, it's gonna cause a problem. So it makes you near the category of the fusaq, among the people who are sinners, even though you're not a fasiq, if you will be doing this excessively. So he says you want to avoid this category, and then he quotes Imam al-Ghazali, and he says consistently doing a mubah can become a minor sin, the way that persistence in a minor sin can actually turn into a major sin. So this is his quote of Ash-Shatibi, and he says, well, look at the general principles that I just presented. We're going to apply the same general principles to video games, and ijtihads are going to differ when it comes to scholars. The last one he talks about is virtual worlds. Now, virtual worlds depends on what is being seen. It could be halal or it could be haram, kind of like a video game. But he says the difference is that a virtual world or using virtual reality has other harms. And the other harms are based on the principle of the Prophet ﷺ, la darar wa la dira. There's no harming and there's no being harmed. So it can affect your eyes if you're using it excessively. It can affect your mind because it has physical potential harms. So in addition to the harms of video games that were mentioned before, when it comes to VR, you have to look out for the physical harms that can be there. And then he takes the exact same principle of Shatibi. In fact, he does the entire quote again. It's like over a page. And he applies it to virtual reality worlds. This was Sheikh Salah al-Sawi's paper. Our paper, myself and Sheikh Umer Khan, we begin with general principles. We say that there's something known as the technology, the value neutrality thesis above technology. And that means that technology can be used for good or it can be used for bad. This is a general theory that's widely accepted in academic circles and in research. So we are accepting this principle and saying you can use it for good or bad. The default principle in Islam is that things are permissible unless they can be proven to be forbidden. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about the Sahaba were sitting on the pathways outside, and when they said, we need to do this, and the Prophet was like, you have to be careful, he gave them some principles. He said, if you see something, avert your sight away. Make sure you give the path its right. Make sure you give salam. Make sure you do this. He didn't tell them that, it's not allowed for you to be in public where bad things are happening. So he didn't say you can't do this. Instead, he gave them principles with which they can follow, knowing that they're going to encounter some things which can be impermissible or haram or something like that. So the principle is, if there's a strong possibility that you're going to experience or you're going to encounter something unlawful, then saddu zari'ah, or blocking the means, would be a general principle that's applied. And you also want to take precautions by using content filters, using safe searches and all that. And once you've taken all those precautions, then if it's still there, you can just look away or, turn down the music or whatever it is. So computer games. Entertainment in moderation is allowed as long as you're not distracted from your obligations, just like Sheikh Salah said. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, he mentions in the tafsir of Surah Al-Takathur, he says, when it says Al-Hakum al-Takathur, he says it's prohibited, Takathur itself, piling up a lot of stuff, is prohibited if it diverts you or distracts you from doing what you're supposed to be doing in this dunya. But he said gathering wealth is permissible. It's not forbidden. So if you're doing it and it's not distracting you, then it's okay. Along the same lines, utilizing technology, as long as it's not distracting you away from your obligations, computer games should not actually fall into the original category or default category of being prohibited or even being disliked, if gathering of wealth is in the same category of being mubah. So we quote 3 fatwas, one from AMJA, one from Islam QA, and one from Seeker's Guidance, to prove that computer games in general are allowed. Right? So we wanted to just, rather than remaking the entire argument, these are some of the fatwas we quoted. We specifically chose these fatwas because if you kind of look at it backwards, Seeker's Guidance is a well-known website for kind of being on the, I'm generalizing here, but kind of like on the Sufi side. So we wanted to say, okay, we got like a little bit Sufi side, fatwa. And then we saw Islam QA, it's kind of like known for being a little bit on like the Salafi side. And then we have AMJA, and AMJA's, again, I'm going to maybe get in trouble for this, but I mean, if we were to categorize AMJA, it might be on the moderate Salafi side or something like that. I don't know if that's allowed or not. But khair, anyway, so we're trying to give a basic broad spectrum of different fatwa that are coming out. So games have a stronger psychological effect than websites, than apps, than all these other programs, because when you play a game, you're more likely to imitate the behavior that you see. So you need to exercise a lot more caution when it comes to games than when it comes to just looking at a website or even looking at a video or something like that. So some prohibited things. So the question was, what if you're doing something prohibited in the game, in real life it would be haram? So let's take suicide. So you're playing Super Mario Brothers, the original Nintendo, old one. And you decide, you know what, I'm going to take Mario and I'm just going to jump off the thing, I'm going to commit suicide. And your point goes down, you lose one life, right? Something like that, there's no real harm, right? There's no real harm to you. There's no real harm to Mario. He's just a figure. And also what's going to happen is there's no psychological effect that's taking place. You're now you're more likely to commit suicide because your Mario character jumped off, a bridge or something like that. So when there's no real harm and there's no ascertainable actual harm from that action that's being prohibited, that's going to fall into a different category. It shouldn't fall into a category of being haram in a game. But when we talk about nudity in a game or foul language or anti-Islamic material that you come across, it actually has real harm. And we're going to talk about the harms more in the VR part. But there's real harm. There's psychological change that takes place. There's a level of imitation that takes place. People who jump Mario off of the building, they're not going to be inclined to jump off of a building themselves. But people who are engaging in, foul language in a game, they're more likely to imitate that behavior in their own life. So there's an actual harmful effect that's taking place. So if that harm is there to a significant extent and is likely, then it should not be allowed unless you can disable that feature or you can filter that feature. When it comes to virtual worlds, prohibited things remain prohibited in the virtual world. And this was the question that was given to us. Can you eat pork in a virtual world? Can you drink khamr? Can you drink alcohol? Can you engage in a riba transaction? And the answer is no, you can't do that in a virtual world. Why? Because nudity in a virtual world should still be haram. Gambling in a virtual world, even though you're not using real money, is still going to be haram because it's going to impact your psyche and or it is tashabbuh bil haram. Right? It's imitating the type of haram that's there. If you go and you're like, you know what, I'm charging riba in a virtual world, there's going to be an effect on you and an effect on people. Your transaction in that world is going to make a difference even if it has no actual effect in the world itself. And so it'll shape your personality. It'll affect you in some way. If you get distracted or if you get addicted, then it's going to be a lot of harm and that's going to be prohibited. The other question we got was robots and AI. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us things for us to use. So we can weigh the harms and benefits of using robots. So one of the questions that came was, what if we're experimenting on animals when it comes to utilizing robots or let's say you're testing a robotic limb on an animal. What's the principle? Number one, you look at the probability of harm. Number two, you look at the amount of harm. Number three, you look at the amount and probability of benefit, and then you weigh it, minimize harm to the animal, and if the benefit's going to outweigh the harm, it will be allowed. The other question we got was liability of harm when it comes to people who are programming artificial intelligence. What if this robotic arm all of a sudden starts, punching everyone and kills them, starts shooting or something like that? Who's liable for that? Are the engineers liable? Are the consultants black box testers, are they liable for that? So we use the same fatwa that has been used throughout many scholars in fiqh. When it comes to medicine, as long as you operate within the procedures of your field, the person who's working or the consultant is not going to be held liable. So there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, if medicine is done by an expert, they're not going to be liable. But if it's done by someone who's not known for medicine, they're going to be liable for that. Imam al-Shafi'i says in Kitab al-He says, if somebody is a cupper, he's doing bloodletting, cupping from the back, or he's circumcising, a child, says if it resulted in harm, there will be no liability as long as they follow the standard operating procedures within a particular field. Who defines those procedures? Who defines whether someone has crossed the boundary? The experts in the field are going to define what the industry standards are for that and whether they've been followed or not. And haram actions in the virtual reality world, it feels very real. So it will affect your mind, it'll affect your body. It affects the dopamine responses in your brain, which is a type of chemical which, if you smoke crack or something, you do heroin. Hope, inshallah, no one's doing that, inshallah, in this room. But, it's going to affect the way in which your dopamine responses happen in your brain. It's also going to affect the neuroplasticity in your brain. So your brain will actually start changing. Like when you watch pornography, the connections and the synapses are going to they're going to be modified. So there's real effects. To simply say that, oh, it's not a big deal, it's just a game, it doesn't affect me, it actually affects you very much, and there's a lot of research to that. So having a romantic relationship with an artificial intelligence program, it causes real arousal. It actually impacts your behavior. A group of sheikhs actually mentioned, they brought up this issue, and they're saying, well, what if you can go into a VR world and you can purchase a milkul yamin, what your right hands possess, and you don't need a nikah contract, and you can have a relationship with her, and you say, well, technically that would be halal because you purchased her and she's your, this is an actual discussion that happens. When we were looking at this, we were like, we don't really need to go into detail about this. And then when we came across this group of, like serious scholars who were really discussing this issue, that's when we said, oh, wait a minute, we gotta take a step back and explain this. So it really has an effect in real life when you go into that virtual reality. Fantasizing about non-permissible partner is not allowed. And I'll conclude with this, inshallah. Imam Nawawi, answered the question. He said, but what if you don't act upon it? It's fake. It's just in your mind. So why would you be held responsible for thoughts that are just in your mind? Imam Nawawi basically says, if you don't dwell on it, right, and you don't keep thinking about it, then it's allowed. But the moment you have a thought and you keep on thinking about that thought, that's when you've crossed the line to it not being allowed anymore. And that's going to be the case of virtual reality. The same thing applies for alcohol, drugs, profanity, gambling, riba, and all of that stuff, depending on what it is. Jazakumullah khairan. And I looking forward to your answers, or your questions, inshallah ta'ala. Also, I'd like to invite Sheikh Umer Khan to be with me during the Q&A session. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
A lot of information in a very short time. Barakallahu feekum. Each of these sessions can take so much longer. We'll quickly jump into Q&A, and like I said, we also have a Q&A session at 11:30 a.m. where the speakers will be available. Let's start with the sisters, inshallah, if there are any questions. And then for the brothers, we have the two mics on the left and the right. If you have any questions, please stand at the line and we'll begin. But we'll start with the sisters. Any questions from the sisters? Oh, there's no mic. Khalas, we'll come back to you while we get that set up. We have the first brother, inshallah. And just as a reminder about the guidelines, please keep questions to 60 seconds or less, and then the answers also we'll try and keep as short as possible so we can get as many questions answered. Barakallahu feek.
Jazakumullah khairan for the lecture and the information. So you mentioned for the VR, if you do certain things like, which is to be haram, especially, for example, the riba transactions. But so what will make the difference in the video games? For video games, 90% of them car crash people, you kill people. So it's all are the same crime. I mean, nowadays, because of the video games of the 3D and 4D, it's almost as if it's like a VR, especially with the higher quality of the monitors. So what will be the rule to differentiate? I mean, even if you look at the chess, the shatranj is the battle. Like even in the past, that you bring two armies, soldiers, and the king, and all of those all are killing things. How can we draw the line to say this is the part, we call it at-tahrim or makruh, or to have a clear guidance, because new things are coming. We need to have certain rules will make it easy, inshallah.
Barakallah feek. So great question. So that's why we mentioned Super Mario Brothers on purpose, 1985, because there's a difference between the modern world in terms of how games are very realistic now when it comes to 3D shoot 'em ups and all of that. And there's some research that shows that there's a connection between being desensitized to violence or something like that. Whereas if you go back and you look at something like Super Mario Brothers, you don't have that level of connection because of it's not as an immersive of an experience. And you mentioned a good point. If you go back to chess, right? So you don't find people playing chess and then all of a sudden they become violent and they be like, you know what, I'm going to go and kill these pawns that are out there. So you don't find that type of behavior. So that's why we mentioned the general principle. So the general principles are when you have the probability and the amount of harm, or in this case, the probability of harm, when it starts to become clearer and clearer that it's rising to a certain level, that's when it's going to become prohibited. That's why it's not really an issue where scholars are going to have to make, that's not a fiqh discussion. That's a discussion of people who are psychologists, people who are in the medical field, people who are social scientists. They're going to go and weigh and see what are the effects of chess on teenagers, what are the effects of the original Super Mario Brothers on teenagers, and what is the effects of metal, what is it called? SubhanAllah, all these other shoot 'em ups, like Assassin's Creed, right? On behavior. So all of these things need to be weighed, and that's not so much a fiqh discussion. So that's why we gave the general principles, and we said these general principles are going to continuously be applied on different forms of technology in order to arrive at a ruling.
Yeah, just to add to that, Bismillah. So we did quote some studies in the article. So if you read it in the book, there are some studies quoted and some examples. But there's a lot of research out there on which type of games have that type of psychological impact and which ones don't. And it's surprising sometimes because if we go by pure intuition, you might think certain violent games have an extreme psychological impact. And the research shows that it's not always the case. So of course research can be wrong, and also in this issue of psychological research on games, فيه قولان, and you see a lot of اختلاف amongst the psychologists as well. But there is quite a bit of research out there, and you'll find that certain types of games, they have an impact when you don't expect it to, and other types of games, they don't have an impact even though you might think they do. So it's important to go to the experts in the field to get this information.
We'll come back to the sisters. Any questions from the sisters' side? The brother on my left.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khairan. A bit of a comment, but it has a question at the end. I noticed that when it comes to major technological advancements, which we're covering several of which today, cryptocurrency, virtual reality, metaverse, and so on, very often we lead with our concerns, which I think we should be doing, which Jazakumullah khairan, and I think that message sometimes comes across to our communities as prohibition until further notice. And what ends up happening is 10 years down the line, when it becomes ubiquitous, it's everywhere, everyone's in virtual reality, they go to school through it, etc., we're just playing catch up, and we take another 20 years or so. And we're just, catching on, like with TikTok and these trends and so on. Now, some things we can clearly put them in the pile of, well, this is something we can't engage in, regardless, TikTok, etc. But I think with virtual reality and metaverse and so on, it seems like much more of a broad world. So my question would be, to what extent should we be encouraging innovation amongst our community members, our youth who are involved in technological developments and so on, so that we don't make this mistake again and end up playing catch up, and after the fact, rulings become, masajid in the metaverse, lectures, or a presence of Muslim community and so on and so forth, instead of just playing catch up and being last to the game and just trying to get a market share after the fact, which we all know it's the toughest thing to do.
Yeah. So, that's a great point. You almost distracted me with AMJA in the metaverse in the future, but yeah, you're right. This is a common problem, is that this is what our communities are hearing, right? And that's why I'm really happy that we did this topic, because we're trying to set these general principles, and we're going with the value neutrality thesis, which is basically that technology has the potential in general to be neutral. So when it comes to Muslims developing technology, we should be doing that, because it can often be used for a massive amount of good. If somebody goes and tries to take that technology and use it for bad, or if there are unforeseen consequences like social media and harms that are there that we find out much later on, probably no one really thought that this was going to be such an addictive technology. So it really comes down to, yes, we should be encouraging the Muslims to develop all sorts of technologies that are either neutral or that seem to be able to be used for positive. Now, if they know that the technology is going to be harmful, or let's say they are focusing on the evolving the addictive nature of, let's say, social media or metaverse or whatever it may be, they probably want to stay out of that particular field if the harms are already well known. You can't be responsible to the extent that you know Allah only.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this field, so if you look at AI, it's sort of been a mess over the last few years in terms of training. I think it was Microsoft who put out some AI technology, and some others have done it. And within a few hours, the training material, the training algorithms and what they were fed turned them into racist AI. And so they were out there and exercising racism and hate, and it was a huge mess. So we can see how technology can go wrong. On the other hand, like you have what you read in science fiction from Isaac Asimov, who talks about the laws of robotics as you're building AI. One of the laws that you built in there is that the first thing is a robot can't harm a human being, right? So we know that we need this ethics and technology. We know we need the algorithms to support that. But how do you write an ethics algorithm, right? How do we do that? So I think as Muslims involved in these fields, it rests upon us to work on that. No doubt about it. We have AI in use today. We have machine learning in use today, deep learning for everything from self-driving cars to now, Tesla is going to release or announce a robot, I think this month, inshallah. So it's upon us to be innovating, going back to the previous questioner, it's upon us to be innovating in these fields and to make sure that the ethics are built into the technology. I actually had I think you were part of the conversation, Sheikh Mustafa and I had a long conversation with Elon Musk once about Neuralink and how Neuralink is this technology that connects to your brain. And we were trying to understand, because this technology is supposed to connect to all our brains and then network amongst itself, how is the ethics going to be built in there? And he thought it was a solvable problem, but it's something that needs to be looked into.
Back to the brother on my right. Again, just a reminder, we have 4 minutes left, so 3 minutes left. Try and keep the question as short as possible and the answer so we can get everybody, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Ayman Nassar from Islamic Leadership Institute, technologist by background, involved with youth. Jazakumullah khair for what you shared, the principles. I think they're extremely important when we talk about fiqh issues and some of the examples you shared. I was wondering if you came across any studies that look at virtual reality from an aqidah perspective, its relationship with mafhum al-hayat, the understanding of, or the meaning of life, and ghaib, that type of understanding relationship. Were there any studies that you came across or anything like that?
I did not, and Sheikh did not.
Back to the sisters. Tafadhal.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khairan for the research. I was wondering if there's a way where we can bridge the gap between the general principles you gave and some of the psychological research and come up with more specific suggestions. For example, like talking, instead of saying harm and benefit and asking people to potentially read psychological research, but maybe we can come up with some more principles around the lines where if games involve killing innocent people, that's been proven psychologically to have more effect. Something a little bit more specific, right? Because most people are going to read the fatwa, but they're not going to go and find the research. And so then at the end of the day, there's nothing they can act upon.
So there were some specific examples that we put into the write-up. However, there were also many issues where we found contradictory information. And so it becomes very difficult to figure out. The experts in the field need to evaluate this, and the experts disagree. There's also many issues, and we'll talk about manufactured meat next, and we're all consuming from foods that have GMO and processed foods and all of this stuff. There's a lot of times where it takes a long period of time to understand how harmful something may be. Right? So if by default we're seeing that something doesn't appear to be harmful, going back to the earlier point, we should make it permissible. And then later on, when the harms become more apparent, then we can go back and change the ruling if we need to, right? This is why we need to be able to adjust. But where we could, we tried to include some information in some papers. But there are, I'll tell you, we went through a large variety of studies on the impact on psychology, impact on social behavior, impact on marriages, impact on maturity of an individual. There's just a lot of research. and you find a lot of difference of opinion amongst the research studies. The other problem is a lot of research is sponsored, so you really have to filter through it, study their methodology, and see. And there's not as much good research, which has proper double-blind studies, which has proper peer review, is not sponsored. But yes, it's a good idea that as we get that research, we should share it amongst ourselves and keep updating the list of these are the things that are permissible, these are the things that are not, these are the things we are concerned about that we haven't validated, and these are the things we're still watching out for.
Yes, I share your frustration that the average Muslim wants more general principles. They want to know hey, are these type of movies okay? Is Grand Theft Auto okay? Is Super Mario Brothers okay? Give me something that I can apply, that I can just do for my kids or I could do for myself. So the problem is that you can't take even the principle that you mentioned. If you say, killing a human, or let's say killing an animal, that would make Super Mario, Mario is going to kill Bowser, he's going to die, or he's going to step on, little monsters or something like that. If that becomes the principle, then all games are off. And you can take it even further. You say, well, chess, one of them represents a king and the queen is killing the king, and I don't know, some example of, feminism or something like that. Somehow you can make some prohibition or whatever it is. So if you take it to that level, the default in things is that they're permissible. Right? So we have to have a very good reason to make them impermissible, and it has to be a greater standard of evidence. So I hear you that it'd be nice to have a list, but what the Muslims should really imitate is the Mormon community, the LDS community. So they've established a video filtering service called VidAngel. If you've heard of that, came from Brigham Young University. This probably should be the standard. Anyone watches a movie, they should use it through VidAngel. You could remove all profanity, you could remove all explicit content, all love scenes, even mention of God with a bad word or anything. So you can do that. So if we had something like that when it came to video games, or at least a rating service or something like that, it's a large project, but that's where the Muslim community should be heading. And we should look into the Mormons, Orthodox Jews, we should look into the conservative Christians who are developing these type of rating systems. That would be a lot better than trying to figure out, say, we want a fatwa from AMJA, which says this category of games is haram and this category of games is halal. Rather a rating system of this is problematic at some level, and that would be probably a lot better since the research is changing, like Sheikh Umar said.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh Mustafa and Sheikh Umar, for joining. And that ends this session. And we actually have Sheikh Umar on stage to jump into the next session, inshallah. I'll invite the moderator for this next session up to the stage, inshallah. The next topic is ruling on manufactured meat. We'll jump right in. Barakallahu feekum, everybody, for your beautiful questions and attentiveness. And Sheikh Mustafa, of course, for your beautiful presentation. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walah wa ba'd. Inshallah, this next section will be with Sheikh Umer Khan, and he'll be talking about the ruling concerning eating meat manufactured in labs from chemicals and raw materials. Inshallah, he'll be speaking for approximately 25 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for question and answers, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Assalamu alaikum. So we're here to talk about the ruling concerning eating meat which is manufactured in labs from chemicals and raw materials. So Sheikh Mustafa and I wrote on a variety of different topics, and we were selected to present on different topics. So he got the fun virtual reality games one, and I got the meat. But it's not as exciting as video games and virtual worlds, and it's actually a relatively simple topic. So there's 3 people who've written on this topic. Sheikh Walid Idris al-Manisi wrote, and his write-up is on page 131 in the Arabic section. And then we have Sheikh Dr. Salah Sawi. He wrote, his section is page 29 and on the Arabic. And then what we wrote is page 23 on the English side. And the write-ups that we have are relatively straightforward. So Sheikh Walid wrote half a page, we wrote a page, Dr. Salah had 2 pages. But inshallah, let's try and go through this. It may not take the full 25 minutes. So manufactured meat that's made in labs is also called cultured meat, healthy meat, slaughter-free meat, vitro meat, vat-grown meat, lab-grown meat, cell-based meat, clean meat, cultivated meat, and synthetic meat. So it goes by many different names. And all of them are just part of the same, they're just trying to figure out what's the best way to name this category. So you find a lot of different names for it, muradifat. So we'll start with Sheikh Walid Idris's view and what he mentions in his paper. And he starts with some general principles. And he says, الحكم الشرعي لا يتعلق بالأسماء وإنما بحقائق الأشياء. So he's trying to explain that when we're coming up with rulings in fiqh, we don't look at the names of things, rather we look at the reality or the truth or the essence of what they are. And then he goes on to explain, and by the way, so he goes on to explain that although manufactured meat may resemble real meat in look and taste, calling it meat does not make it real meat. And therefore, based on the original ruling of permissibility, manufactured meat should be permissible as long as the materials that are used to make the manufactured meat are permissible themselves. So why does he talk about, we don't base things on the names that we've given things, but rather the reality? Because I think we have to establish what the default principle is. He doesn't mention this in his paper, but I'm assuming he wants to establish the default. And I actually pasted a link from Dr. Salah Sawi where he talks about what are the original rulings. Because we all know al-aslu fil ashya al-ibaha, right? The original ruling in anything is permissibility. However, when it comes to meat, most of the scholars, the majority of the scholars from the four schools, they argue that al-aslu fil luhumi at-tahrim. That in meat, the original ruling is that it is prohibited. So I assume this is why Sheikh Walid brought it here, because he wanted to establish that this is not really meat. Because it's not meat itself originally, we can start from a position of permissibility, and if it's made from permissible materials, we can go on and eat that. But what if it is not made from permissible materials? What if it is made from prohibited materials? So then he goes on and says, we have to see if istihala has taken place. So I know we have some students of knowledge here and others. So istihala would be a chemical transformation, where if you're able to take an impure substance and it goes through a complete chemical transformation in a way that it becomes pure, okay? And if you really want to understand this, I think a good explanation is given by Dr. Yasir Qadi in his Doritos article. A long time ago, he wrote this article on Doritos and explained how istihala works, what chemical transformation means, and how the scholars have differed if this chemical transformation takes place in a more natural fashion or if humans intervene and force the transformation, what the differences are between the madhahib and so on and so forth. But regardless, clearly Dr. Walid Idris is saying that if something was prohibited and it's gone through a complete chemical transformation such that it is pure now, this would be considered permissible. And this is also, by the way, the position of almost all of the modern fiqh councils that you will find. And of course, if istihala did not take place, then that meat would not be permissible. Now, Sheikh Walid does not actually mention with all of these meats if istihala did or did not take place. He's sharing with us here a general principle. I think the reason for this is because a lot of this manufactured meat is new. When we're talking about manufactured meat, especially use of stem cells, a lot of it is new, and so we don't really know if istihala has taken place or not. It would require more research about this. Moving on to manufactured meat from stem cells, Sheikh Walid quotes two other contemporary people. One person explains that basically use of stem cells, if it's taken from vegetables, would be considered permissible because it's obviously a vegetable source. And Dr. Bassam Ashati, he states that if it's taken from animals that are permissible to slaughter, that would also be considered permissible. And he adds to that an important principle that animal blood or use of blood serum, which is something that's extracted from blood, would be considered prohibited because we all know the verse from the Quran where Allah talks about blood being prohibited. So he's expressing these general principles. Moving on to Dr. Salah As-Sawi's view. He again provides some general principles. So it's manufactured meat would be considered permissible to eat, sell, and buy if the raw materials are permissible and if the manufacturing does not result in something that is harmful for humans, and you go and consult experts in the field and make sure some sort of medical body has approved it. I believe in the US that's the FDA. And then he goes on to provide evidence for this from the Quran. اليوم أحل لكم الطيبات, that everything good has been made permissible for us. قل لا أجد ما أوحي إلا محرما. So he goes on and gives several verses. You can read them inshallah in the paper. Then Dr. Salah goes through and divides manufactured meat into two categories. Okay? And the first one is really the main question that was being asked as a part of the AMJA list of questions, which is meat manufactured from stem cells in labs. That picture you see is not just a pretty design, those are actually stem cells. Okay? So this was demonstrated in 2013 by Mark Post. And that's actually a burger patty made from stem cells that you see on the screen. And then since then, several more prototypes have been developed. And due to some limited research, basically, this has not been commercialized yet, but the commercialization is coming. And it's unclear yet if consumers will accept this technology, if they will adopt it, if they will like it, and if they will go ahead and purchase it. So Dr. Salah says there is not a need for haste in issuing a fatwa, because we don't yet know the source of the stem cells, we don't know what ingredients they used in the manufacturing process, we don't know what impact it has to human health, due to all of these things, and because it's not in the markets yet, it's too early to give a fiqh ruling on it. The second type of meat that Dr. Salah talks about is something that I think we've seen in the market and it's been around for a very, very long time, which is processed meat. So this would be things like beef jerky, luncheon meat, and mortadella, it would be bologna, things like that. And he says, if the animal itself is permissible to eat meat from, then one can eat, buy, and sell this type of meat. He quotes the same verse he quoted earlier. And he says the method of manufacture and the way we store it should be healthy for humans. There should be no harm. And then he says it should not be from something, it should be basically follow the Islamic laws of being halal. Right? It should not be drowned or electrocuted or something like that. It should be slaughtered by a Muslim, etc., etc. Moving on to what Sheikh Mustafa and I wrote in our papers. So the main question, first of all, to clarify, the question is about cultured meat, not plant-based meats. That wasn't part of the question. But just to address that, because everybody wants to know, is this about impossible meat? Is this about Beyond Burgers, things like that? No, the question is not about plant-based meats, because plant-based meats are very simple. They're made from plants. I think Impossible uses heme from plants, and Beyond uses red beet roots or something like that, red beet juice. So they have different ways of simulating blood and so on and so forth, and that's not a problem, inshallah. The question is more about cultured meats. And cultured meats, even though Dr. Salah said it's not been commercialized, yes, it's not been commercialized in the US, it has started to become commercialized in other parts of the world. So for example, in Singapore, it has been commercialized. And so we do need to have an opinion about this because we don't want to be catching up. So how do cultured meats work? They're made from stem cells, and these stem cells can come from one of two types of resources. They can come from either live animals, and they're taken with minimally invasive procedures. They don't harm the animal. So if they're taken from live animals, as long as it is an animal that we are permissible to eat, there should not be a problem, inshallah. However, they can also be taken from a recently slaughtered animal, an animal that has either been, a dead animal of some sort, slaughtered or not slaughtered. And of course, we will need to follow the Islamic standards for halal for that one. So what you see here is a picture of this is a company called Supermeat, based out of Israel. And they have a restaurant called The Chicken, and in which they serve this chicken salad. And this is available today. So again, it's not commercialized, but you can go to this restaurant, make a reservation, and go eat this chicken salad with manufactured chicken meat. This one is a picture of Orbillion Bio, and it's a picture of meatloaf. They also make bison meat, manufactured bison meat, manufactured sheep meat, and manufactured deer meat. And this last one is from a company called Avant Foods, and they make manufactured fish. So you can have fish fillet and other types of fish available from them. So you can see the tension here, right? Dr. Salah mentions we shouldn't hasten to give a ruling. At the same time, these products are starting to become commercially available. So, there's this tension between giving a ruling quickly and then changing it versus taking your time to do the due diligence, something we're always trying to struggle with. So the way that we approached this subject was to look at the benefits versus the harms. Sheikh Mustafa explained earlier why we do this. And so the people who promote cultured or cultivated meat, they argue that it reduces the impact on the environment for meat production.
that it reduces the production cost of meat and therefore increases profits for businesses, and it helps us avoid artificial growth hormones and antibiotics, which are used quite commonly in meats nowadays. At the same time, the potential harms are not fully known, but it is artificial, and we never know with artificial things what impact it might have unless a long period of time has passed and a lot of research has been done. So there doesn't appear to be a strong need to use this meat, but there are some potential benefits. So our conclusion, we don't yet have a lot of long-term data on the impact. Of course, we have none. So we put it in the same ruling as other manufactured types of things that humans have done, GMOs, processed foods, etc., where you can consume it in moderate amounts, but you have to exercise caution because it could lead to long-term harm, and we don't know. So just to summarize, plant or vegetable-based manufactured meats, such as Impossible and Beyond, are permissible. Cultured meat that comes from stem cells of live animals is permissible if the animal is permissible to eat. Processed meats like jerky, bacon, bologna, etc., and cultured meat, which comes from recently slaughtered animals, is permissible as long as the proper procedure has been followed for slaughtering, and the animal is permissible to eat, or istihala has taken place, as Dr. Walid said. And then cultured meat from live animals is permissible if the animal itself is permissible to eat. Okay? So in all cases, we want to make sure that human health is not impacted in any way, and that no additives are used in the manufacturing process that may be prohibited, such as blood or blood serum. One of the benefits that comes from having multiple people write on a fatwa is we had Dr. Walid Idris write on this, we had Dr. Salah, and we had ourselves write. And even though we went into a lot of detail on the research, we forgot to mention like a very, very basic principle, which is that when you're extracting stem cells, the stem cell should be extracted from an animal that's permissible. So even though that's like very obvious, we had that in our mind, we didn't mention that in our fatwa. So I think it just highlights, I wanted to share it, highlights the importance of peer review, multiple people writing about something, and running it past each other to make the fatwa stronger, inshallah. And so we have Jazakumullah khairan. Any questions are welcome, and Sheikh Mustafa, if you can come up here as well if people have questions.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh Umar, for that enlightening presentation. Inshallah, we have now 27 minutes for questions, inshallah. From 9:30 to 10 o'clock we have a break, and then our next session will be at 10 o'clock, inshallah. So we'll take questions, again, from the right side, from the left side, and from the sisters, inshallah. So the first question, inshallah, the brother sitting there, inshallah. Please, again, keep your question short, and so we can get as many questions in as possible, inshallah.
Sheikh Umar, you mentioned regarding the stem cells, if it's taken from a permissible animal, then it'll be permissible. I guess why would it be permissible considering if you have a permissible animal, a cow for example, if you chop its leg off, I mean, you can't eat the leg, as far as I know. So why would it be permissible to just take the stem cell from the live animal?
Yeah, good question. So as I had mentioned, the way the stem cells are extracted from live animals is it's done in a procedure that doesn't actually harm or hurt the animal. So it's the stem cell extraction procedure is not actually harmful to the animal. You're not chopping up a limb. You're extracting just the stem cells. So it's really not an issue. Similar to I think bone marrow works that way. There's other types of extraction procedures that exist. So there's no harm to the animal. If there was harm, that would be a different issue, of course.
So was that the issue, or you're talking about it becomes meta if you chop off part of the animal and it's not being slaughtered? Is that a second part of it? Okay, so yeah, so I'll address the second part. So the second part of it is, I think what you're trying to say is that, if you cut part of an animal off, it's meta because the animal's not been slaughtered, right? But what's happening here is we're not talking about actual meat that's coming from a slaughtered animal. What we're talking about is extraction of part of an animal to actually grow another product, which is not being classified as an actual living animal. So it's not actually gone through the process of turning into another living animal that required sacrifice to take place, right? So I know this was the initial thought process that we had when we first came across this issue. In fact, the Fiqh Council of North America, we had discussed this, a few years ago as well when we were talking about it. The problem with the argument is there's an assumption that stem cell coming from an animal being turned into a burger patty, like we saw in in 2013, somehow that needed to be slaughtered before making it into the burger patty. But the thing is, there's no possibility of a slaughter because it never turned into an animal. Therefore, it was never a living thing, depending on how you define life, in terms of life being a cell versus life being an animal. So that's why there's no possibility of slaughter. The mas'ala, or the issue of this being meta, because it's part of an animal, doesn't play a role in the fiqh discussion. Okay.
Jazakumullah khairan. Inshallah, a question from the sisters? Do you have any questions from the sisters? All right, the question from the last side.
Kept Shaykh Faqih waiting,
Yeah.
inshallah, even though he was up here first.
He was up here before the questions even started.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, if I may give feedback, I think it would be a better choice to recite the verse fully in Arabic for the barakah of it. Well, and this was the tradition of the scholars. So don't skip it, especially someone who has amazing tajweed and beautiful qira'ah.
Jazakumullah khairan for the feedback.
The other point that I wanted to make is I still do not see how we can make a distinction between the two. Right? Well, I'm talking about the cultured meat. So they're either, whether it's from a dead animal or from a live animal, right? If the process makes it valid, then they should both be halal. But if we're saying that al-asl bil-luhum wal-dhaba'ih التحريم إلا ما ذكي تذكية شرعية, then that doesn't apply to both of them. So both of them should not be permissible. And I think this issue needs to be looked at carefully before a final verdict is given, especially that it involves manipulation of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It goes against the natural process. I think there's much more to اشتراط الذبح والتسمية على الذبائح لحل اللحوم. So I have an issue with the entire basically concept of manufacturing meat in labs. So maybe it needs to be reviewed again. وضحت الفكرة شيخ عمر؟
No. So we're just joking because when we look at these issues, sometimes people say it's not a fiqh issue, it's an aqidah issue. Especially when we get emotional about these things, automatically, that's not a fiqh issue, it's an aqidah issue.
We were talking about this last night. Sometimes people are very passionately attached on certain issues, and when they're very passionate about something, this is not even a fiqh issue. It's straight up aqidah.
Yeah. As far as the concept of manufacturing food, I mean, I think we all hopefully realize and are aware and are cautious with the food that we eat every day, because a good chunk of it is manufactured, right? If you go buy a bag of chips or something and you look at how much of that is real versus not. So I don't want to necessarily get into that debate, but a large amount of food consumed nowadays by the average American, and I don't know what percentage, is either completely or to a large extent or partially manufactured, right? So we're certainly, and I think that's sort of the point I was trying to make, is when we're messing with the creation of Allah like this, and we are not following food that is tabi'i, we're not following food that is, from our fitrah, that is, as Allah says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas kulu mimma fil ardi halalan tayyiba, right? And so we might say it's halal, is it tayyib? Right? That's the question. And we don't necessarily know the answer. We're messing with things. We're messing with things. We don't know the long-term outcome, but we can't start from a position of impermissibility on that. But we need to be very, very cautious. Your point about why it should be halal in both cases, I wasn't following that point. But
I wanted to respond to that. So, I mean, that's a good point, actually. So, in the slide, we mentioned in the paper that the overwhelming majority of cases, it's going to be coming from a live animal.
Yes.
It's in a very small minority that there's a possibility that it comes from a dead animal. And this was addressed by, I believe, Sheikh Walid and maybe Sheikh Salah as well in the paper. We didn't really tackle this issue very much because it's very improbable that it's going to be happening anyways. But if we had to tackle it, since you're bringing it up, I'll tackle it right now. So
we did tackle it. So the way that it was handled. So it varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. That's the way it works. A particular manufacturer will each manufacturer that you see nowadays, and again they're not commercialized. So it's commercialized in Singapore, and there's a restaurant in Israel. It's not available here. But for every manufacturer, if you go, they will publish their methodology for creation of the meat. So they will explain to you, are the stem cells taken from live animals, or are the stem cells taken from meta? Okay, and so based on the manufacturer and their process, the ruling will vary. It's not a general ruling, it's a ruling that will be based on the specific manufacturer and their technique.